Okay, so I'm going to get started. It's just 2:01, and I think if there's anyone else coming, they'll just join us as we go. So welcome everybody. It's really my pleasure to welcome everyone to the next Scenes of Shame and Stigma in COVID-19 seminar as part of our ongoing seminar series. This is part of a research project that has been funded by the UKRI-AHRC Rapid Response to COVID call that was part of the funding environment last year, and also part of our Wellcome Trust funded Scenes of Shame and Stigma, our Wellcome Trust funded Shame and Medicine project. And I'm joined here with my co-investigators, Fred Cooper and Arthur Rose. And I'm going to put the link into the chat, or maybe Fred or Arthur could do it, of our of the seminar series, so you can see the talks that have come before and our final talk that is coming up in December. And all of the talks are recorded, as this one will be, so you can revisit previous talks and also revisit this one if you are interested. So I'm really delighted today to welcome a colleague to present her research, Hannah Farrimond. Hannah is a senior lecturer in sociology here at the University of Exeter, and her research spans many really interesting things, including, let me read the list: stigma in relation to COVID, cultural understandings of tobacco harm reduction, pharmaceutical cultures over time, healthy aging and addiction, and the role of stigma in public health. And so her research is really relevant to the work we're doing with the Scenes of Shame and Stigma in COVID project, but we're looking at stigma and shame in relation to public health policy in the UK. So I'm really delighted to welcome Hannah, and really excited to hear her talk about stigma mutations. I think Hannah's going to share her screen because she's got slides, and what we'll do is listen to Hannah's talk, and then after we will open the floor for questions and discussion. So I will turn my camera back on at the end and share the conversation. Go ahead, Hannah.
Okay, hi everybody. First of all, I have to get my screen up. Oh, and start at the beginning. That's a very important thing, isn't it? Okay, so yeah, hello everybody. I'm absolutely delighted that Luna and colleagues have asked me to be speaking today. And essentially, I suppose what I'm going to do, and I mean, it's been fantastic, this whole series. It's really made me think so much about the whole issue of COVID-19 stigma. And so what I wanted to do today is essentially, I suppose, spill the thoughts that I had, and also relating to a paper that I wrote during lockdown. So it sort of spans quite a lot of different areas, but essentially what I want to present to you today is an idea about stigma mutation and whether we can use this as a metaphor to try and understand continuity and change in COVID-19 stigma. Oh, I'm not able to go forward with my slide. Okay, why would that be?
Hannah, you might need to use your mouse and click the little arrows in the bottom left of the slide.
Okay, I normally don't have a problem with going back and forward. I'm not quite sure what I'm doing wrongly.
If you hover your mouse on the bottom left of that slide, do little arrows appear?
Sorry about that. I'll just have another go. I'm not sure whether I have to share that one or that one. Let me have another go. From beginning. Okay. Yeah, that seems like it's working. Is that okay now? I'm really sorry. Okay. Okay, perfect. So as I said, I think this, this whole project for me, there was a lot of time to think in lockdown. And essentially what I did, I suppose, is try to understand what Strong has labeled as a plague of fear, panic, suspicion, and stigma that follows the outbreak of novel fatal epidemic disease. So obviously that seminal paper. And I suppose the question that I was asking myself as I went forward into this is, how should we conceptualize this plague of stigma that's going along with the plague of the virus, if you like? And so this is what I'm going to be talking about today. So I've kind of done an outline. I don't know if I've been teaching too much lately, and I've just thought it would be easier to tell everybody where I was going with this. But essentially what I'm going to do is explain, and of course, a lot of you are very familiar with the stigma literature, but I'm just going to very briefly go through the problem and consequences of pandemic stigma. And then I'm going to present, as I said, this kind of novel metaphor of mutation. And essentially what I'm trying to do is give us I suppose, a vocabulary, a way to think through emergent stigma as it both emerges, then changes, then mutates, and continues to change. This is not something that ends now, of course. And the way that I've chosen to conceptualize this is, like I say, using this metaphor of mutation, but with 3 particular dimensions, and I'm going to illustrate each of those as I go through. The first of these is stigma lineage, and this essentially speaks to the fact that stigmas do not come out of nowhere. They have historical lineage relating to other stigmas and to other concepts of plague and so forth, and I'll give some examples around that. Secondly, the second dimension of this is stigma variance. So we know that stigma doesn't manifest in the same way in lots of different places. And so the 2 things that I'm interested in there are how the content changes over time. So for example, the stigma lineage might mean that a certain type of stigma becomes very activated early on, but we get to know new things about the virus, and then that changes how the stigma itself is then manifest. And the second thing in stigma variance also relates to location. So we know that stigma manifests, so COVID-19 stigma manifests differently internationally and so forth. And the third of these dimensions that I want to illustrate is stigma strength. And I just want to say a little note about that, because stigma strength isn't about any individual stigma experience. It's not denoting anything about individual experiences. What I'm getting at with stigma strength is the idea of bigger macro waves of stigma, where you get a sudden amplification of stigma, but you also get destigmatization and counter-stigmatization, because I think it's really important that as we go forward trying to theorize stigma, we not only know how to spot stigma, but we also need to spot where it's not occurring, where there are counter forces and so forth. So that's what I'm trying to do there. And I'm going to use lots of eclectic examples, and I'm sure you can probably think of some of your own as we go through. But the core thing that I'm trying to explain is that I'm seeing stigma as a process, and that then allows us to conceptualize how it might change in a very fast-moving, very complex world, which is both globalized, and we see global trends in stigma, but also highly local. So that's where we're heading. My goodness, if we get there, it'll be amazing. Okay, so I want to tell you just a little bit about my influences before we start. Obviously, I mean, I reread Goffman's book, I should think, about every 2 years, and of course it's a fantastic classic, but I think the influences that I've had more recently have particularly been drawn from the reconceptualization of stigma in sociology. I'm thinking particularly of the work of Professor Imogen Tyler, and her recent book on stigma machinery. And I think that what that work is doing is telling us to pay attention, to history, so in other words, how history repeats itself, but more importantly, perhaps, how power repeats itself. In other words, how historical institutional trajectories of stigma, so for example, the branding of slaves, literally marking, there's a social disgrace being marked on the body, then for example, got recreated in the Nazi era through tattoos or the wearing of yellow stars and so forth. So that's fantastic. In fact, I've even got her book right here. Absolutely wonderful. And the second person that I've been particularly influenced by is Professor Graham Scambler, of course, a great influence in the world of stigma theory, but it was particularly the paper in 2018 about the weaponization of stigma that really spoke to me. And this is a very interesting idea where you get shame, so the shame of stigma, then paired with blame, and it sort of amplifies it, and then that makes stigma useful. And so he argued in this particular paper that, for example, blaming benefit scroungers then draws attention away from others that may be much more culpable, such as capitalist business or government or so forth, because we're blaming the people over there. So I think that those influences, to me, the thing I've taken from that is to ask, who is doing the stigmatizing and why are they doing the stigmatizing, rather than seeing it just as a sort of interpersonal interaction that has just arisen for some reason. As anybody that's been coming to this series knows, and I'm probably repeating it already, essentially we know that where you have fear of contagion, which of course is reasonably rational when we start out in a pandemic, you know, I remember back in, I don't know, February, March 2020, COVID-19 was really, really scary. It still is scary, but it's not as scary as it was then. And so obviously fear of contagion is not actually irrational, but what we do then know is that that fear becomes amplified, projected onto other groups, often unfairly and so forth, and used to mark and shame others. And of course, the problem with this is that it really affects then how much we can contain a pandemic. If people are emotionally distressed and psychologically distressed because of that stigma, if they're hiding their status or hiding other people's status and so forth, if they're experiencing discrimination, shunning, even just microaggressions in relation to that, all of this is the negative consequences of stigma in relation to pandemics. And of course, it also does things like increase the risk to healthcare workers. And actually, there's been some very interesting papers come out from all over the globe that have indicated that healthcare workers have been quite heavily stigmatized and even, you know, experienced aggression and violence around the world. So, as I said, I want to introduce to you this metaphor of mutation. And the reason I guess it appeals to me, not just because I've sat in a building with lots of philosophers of biology for a very long time, is that I think it just gives us a very useful vocabulary. And it strikes me that I suppose what I think a theory of pandemic stigma needs to do is to explain how stigma emerges, how it mutates over time, and how it changes in response to contexts. And of course, this change, just like with viruses, can be incredibly rapid. You get a new mutation all of a sudden, or it can take much longer, and there are longer trajectories, and we can see examples of both of these in the material that I'm going to present. Okay, so I'm going to start then with stigma lineage and work my way through the 3 dimensions. So, as I said when I was sort of introducing this talk, the idea of stigma lineage is borrowed from viruses. Viruses essentially have an evolutionary heritage, and my argument is that stigma does too. In other words, each version of the stigma is evolving from its predecessor. So we know that COVID-19 doesn't develop in stigma doesn't develop in isolation. In other words, it's part of a lineage of what we might term plagues or epidemics or so forth. I've given some examples there, but Black Death, bubonic plague, HIV and AIDS, Ebola, SARS, MERS, and so forth. And the point is that when you pick up this word, such as plague, it then carries that historical connotation with it, of cataclysm, of chaos, and of a sort of end of the world as we know it. Now, the important thing to say about stigma lineage as a concept, of course, is that stigma lineage, just as with viruses, is not complete. In other words, the new variant, if you like, isn't identical to the old variant. There's many ways in which, for example, the stigma around HIV and AIDS as a sexually transmitted or bloodborne virus is very, very different. But I suppose what I'm asking from this is to try and talk about what some of the similarities might be. So, for example, we often see the idea of plagues as all kind of an act of purification for a sinful world. In other words, it's the fact we defied nature, for example, by eating the wrong kinds of animals and trading them in wet markets, or polluting the world. And then COVID-19 has often been portrayed as almost, at one time, even a solution to that pollution, if you like, and there were apocryphal tales of dolphins in the Venice canals and so forth. So I think there are differences within that lineage, but also similarities. And the other point to make before we go on to the example is, of course, that these new representations of stigma are emotionally driven. So they aren't just a kind of rational response. They're very emotional. They're about what is scary about this particular virus. And of course, COVID-19 can be both symptomatic and asymptomatic and invisible. And I don't really have time to talk about breath as a contaminant and pollution and Douglas and so forth, but there are lots of reasons why, you know, there's continuation of that. Okay, so what I'd like to do then is illustrate the idea of lineage in relation to origin narratives, because what they show, I think, in COVID-19 is a very strong lineage pattern. So origin or outbreak narratives, they're sometimes called, are essentially stories that explain why something's happened. What is the cause of this terrible new virus? And there's a lot of concentration on origins, especially early in a pandemic. So there's an obsession with finding patient zero, who, of course, poor patient zero, I often think that must be literally the most stigmatized person possible. You know, the patient who brought this into a particular community. And the important thing to say about origin narratives, of course, is they're moral stories. They tell us who's to blame. And on the one hand, they're very understandable. We're trying to make sense. Who's carrying this? Who's causing this? But on the other hand, of course, we know that it's often the other that is then identified as the source of contamination. We see this very clearly in relation to COVID-19 origin stories. And essentially what has been argued by many other scholars is that there was a huge amplification of existing anti-Chinese and existing anti-Asian sentiment. For example, Tesla, Choi and Cao said it was almost like Asian Americans became then the embodiment of that outsider and being foreign and so forth. And that was very much amplified in the early stages of COVID-19. The outbreak story really played into that. So it was all about the wet market at Wuhan. There were lots of pictures that I think were kind of perhaps were there to evoke disgust and so forth. Oh my goodness, you know, this seems really quite horrific. And that origin story had a lot of elements of stigma. It was about an other, so from the east to the west, a disgust, threat, and so forth. I've put up a quote there just illustrating this kind of stigmatizing tweeting that was going on. Brian Adams, if you don't know who that is, it's I think he's a guitar singer and pop star. I'm not even going to repeat the quote, the tweet. He did apologize afterwards for saying this, but that just illustrates that kind of blame game that was going on around these COVID-19 origins. And there's some interesting work that's gone on that shows that this othering is really prevalent, not just in the UK, not just in America, it also in Chile, for example. And also the first talk that we had in this series, one of the scholars there was telling us that there was actually a lot of othering between North and South China. So the North blaming the South for the particular type of animals they were eating and so forth. So we see that very strongly. The other thing that's really noticeable about this lineage, though, is that it's a political lineage. So there was a huge weaponizing of that anti-Asian rhetoric, if you like. I have one of the culprits on the screen. This is President Trump. I think this is just after he was recovering from COVID. He has a lot of makeup on, obviously, to make him look as healthy as possible, I suppose, and to perform his virility and place as the world leader and so forth. But I think it's really arguable that this anti-Asian stigma was amplified, racialized, and then used for political purposes. Trump was going on about the Wuhan virus, the China virus, the Chinese plague, Kung flu, way after other people were saying, look, this is stigmatizing to associate this with location names. And I think we can argue that this pejorative labeling was part of a wider strategic action against China, and also worked as a deflection against, the inefficiency and lack of action at home. So, you know, essentially I've borrowed Scambler's term of weaponizing, and I'm arguing essentially that this is what has occurred. Now, of course, where you get this amplification of stigma, you can also get resistance. So, for example, in the US, you had Asian stigma campaigns, hashtag Stop Asian Hate and so forth. But I think the point I'm trying to make in the stigma lineage section is that the lineage of stigma is both made and remade over time, but also stigma's power in the present is linked to its prior manifestations. Okay, and that's what I wanted to say about stigma lineage. Okay, so the second dimension that I wanted to talk about is stigma variation, and I've got a couple of quite different examples for this. So what I'm trying to argue here is that stigma is a bit like viruses. You get new variants of stigma, and we can look for that, for example, in content change over time. So we get new knowledge about who carrier groups might be, for example, and that then leads to stigma being projected onto additional outgroups. And you also get cultural variation in varying locales around the world, and, you know, essentially because you've got both global and local forces going on. But, and I think, again, this is where we relate back to the point about lineage, these variants don't emerge randomly. They emerge along social fracture lines, as Raleen and colleagues have described it, where there is existing or localized prejudice and inequality. And that's why it's interesting to look at that type of cultural variation. So to sort of move this metaphor forward, I started to think, who are the groups then that are at risk of COVID? And as you might remember, originally, as I said, there was this kind of amplification of it's a Chinese virus and so forth. But over time, we started to understand that, in fact, the people who are most at risk of COVID-19, of disease and death, are essentially people who are in situations where they're socially unequal and social inequalities. So the risk of disease and death is highest for old people, especially the oldest old, those with pre-existing health conditions, people who are in poverty, so have socioeconomic disadvantage, Black and ethnic minority groups, those with severe psychiatric conditions, people who are displaced and homeless, and people who are overweight or obese. And it occurred to me that essentially what we have here is almost kind of a list of stigmatized groups in the West. And this then places these groups in a kind of invidious position where they have quite a fragile social identity, because on the one hand, being identified as potentially at risk of COVID could, you know, being vulnerable, if you like, identifies them as victims who are in need of protection. So, for example, they might be on shielding lists, or they might be at the top of a vaccination list. But by identifying them as at risk, they are also then identified as a risk to the social body. And that can then lead to discrimination and devaluation. So I prefer to term them not so much at-risk groups, but risky, because their social identity is risky. And I'm going to use an example of this, which I came across actually only yesterday. I was thinking about the issue of weight, and I'd written about that in the paper, but I was just Googling some stuff around weight and COVID-19, and I came up with this advert, and essentially it's from I think it's a obesity action group that work out of Florida. And the idea is then that they're giving advice to people who are obese about COVID and how to keep themselves safe and so forth. But the first thing that strikes you about this advert, or it strikes me anyway, is that you've got the pairing of these two things together. It's reinforcing in your mind COVID-19 stigmatized condition, obesity stigmatized condition, and it's joining them together in a kind of constellation of stigma, if you like. And we know, for example, that weight stigma is particularly high because where you've got things that are deemed to be controllable, I'm not saying that weight is necessarily controllable, that where it's deemed to be controllable, then there's much stronger attributions of blame. So we know that weight stigma is already very pronounced in the West. with connotations of laziness, loss of control. There's a huge amount of papers on this. And as I said, so on the one hand, so it's a double-edged sword to be identified as vulnerable. On the one hand, you, for example, might get vaccination priority, but on the other hand, you're then identified as a target for health promotion. I haven't got the video here, but you can Google it, it's online, which is essentially Boris Johnson, after he had COVID himself, of course, came out and said, you know, I was very overweight and this is one of the reasons, and declared a war on fat. And of course, you know, if you watch this video, essentially he's going for a jog with his dog. It's all about what you as an individual can do about weight. And he didn't say anything really about what industry could do to make products healthier. And so again, we're just going back to this kind of victim blaming and shaming, and if you just jogged with your dog a little bit more type thinking. So I'm not arguing, of course, that COVID-19 is driving weight stigma, because of course it isn't. But what I'm arguing is that there's a further retrenchment of the obese as a risk to the social body by making those type of links. Okay. I then just want to again briefly address the issue of cultural variation, and I'm not able to do so, you know, too expansively. There were so many examples that I could have picked on. Obviously, the paper that I wrote was speaking from a Western perspective, identifying myself as not only just in the UK, but in England and in the Southwest, which is quite a distinctive place, has been quite a distinctive place to be. So I could have picked hundreds of examples, but the one that Jadoo and colleagues had written about was particularly interesting, because what they were arguing is in Iraq that there was a very intense stigmatization as sufferers of COVID-19. And apparently, I think Iraq, for various different reasons, had a very intense wave of COVID-19 stigma almost immediately as it appeared in China. And they start to explore some of the reasons for this. And there are both commonalities with elsewhere, and I've mentioned those, which are things like conspiracy theories. So people in Iraq are just as likely to blame the government, feel like healthcare providers might have some interest in this pandemic and so forth. So there was a lot of commonalities there. But what they did identify was a particular driver of stigma that we've seen before, actually, in, for example, Ebola stigma, which is around traditional death practices. So in Iraq, traditional death practices are conceptualized as very family-based and very private. And of course, COVID-19, which requires containment prior to death and then quarantine after death, is absolutely antithetical to this. And they were saying that this is why people are hiding status. They're terrified to identify themselves as you know, or their family members as having COVID-19. Now, that's not the end of the story, because it never is with stigma. And it's interesting that, for example, I was reading that Iraqis, for example, have been going online onto Facebook and setting up you know, pages to offer condolences in a kind of non-traditional forms and so forth. So these things are never absolutely simple. But I suppose what I'm trying to argue in this section about variants is that stigma variants emerge both locally and globally. And you're going to see that in the third section that I'm going to go on to present as well. Okay, so that was stigma variation. And finally, I'm going to talk about stigma strength. So, as I said, I actually debated whether stigma strength was a very good term to use. And that's because I was worried that people would think it was referring to individual examples of stigma, and it isn't. I'm referring in stigma strength to sort of larger macro waves of stigma, where you get essentially stronger and weaker forms. So like with, you know, with COVID-19, we're always terrified that a stronger form is going to appear, but we also know that as viruses mutate, they can mutate into weaker forms. And it's interesting to look at how, for example, stigma can amplify. And I think I've already used the example of the amplification of existing anti-Asian and anti-Chinese stigma to illustrate that already. So I'm actually not going to say very much in this section about amplification, because I kind of feel like I've covered that. But it's also interesting to me to think about how stigma can weaken over time or not appear at all. I mean, I think there were some interesting configurations in which you might have expected stronger stigma to emerge, and there seem to be some countervailing forces there. So I want to argue that stigma can weaken through two primary, or perhaps even more than that, pathways. One is, of course, that government or public health can actually actively intervene. So we can have active anti-stigma interventions, and I'm going to give a couple of examples of that in a minute. But it's also interesting to me that I think stigma can weaken through either destigmatization, something becoming less stigmatized over time, or through counter-stigmatization, where there are literally countervailing forces that are preventing it, amplifying in the first place. And I think it's really important that in a processual account of stigma, we do speak to this complex change over time, where you get both amplification, but also looking at why things don't amplify as much as they could have done, and what those forces might be. Okay. So I'm just going to give a couple of examples here of anti-stigma interventions. These are just, I've just chosen sort of fairly typical ones, I suppose. And I think, in fact, at least one of these has been mentioned already in the seminar series. So the first of these is, of course, the WHO, seeing Trump and continuing to go on about the Wuhan virus, essentially decided that they ought to intervene on the issue of using names that are associated with locations or countries, and that they put out a report that said that this was stigmatizing and suggested an alternative classificatory system that is based on Greek letters. So, of course, now instead of the Indian variant, we have the Delta variant. And I've been quite impressed, I suppose, in how quickly that new language was adopted. I'm the first to admit that every morning I look at the front page of the Daily Mail, the Guardian, the Times, just to have a look really at sort of how culturally these things are being portrayed. And I'll leave it to your imagination which of the newspapers took longer to use the term Delta variant than the other. They were about a week behind the others, but eventually everybody decided to play ball, and we've moved to the Delta variant, and the Indian variant is no more. Of course, we have the Kent variant and so forth. So that's quite an obvious, it was a WHO active anti-stigma intervention. This one, I mean, a lot of the kind of the NHS stuff that came out quite early on was quite fear-based, but I thought this was quite an interesting universalist message. Anyone can get it, anyone can spread it. And I think that probably speaks to the fears that we had around what went wrong essentially with HIV and AIDS campaigning very early on, in which particular groups were associated with the virus. So it's the idea that everybody needs to change their behavior and anyone can get it, and anyone can spread it. Of course, we know now that not anyone can get it, and actually some people are more at risk than others. But I think that was an attempt, at least, to a kind of universalist message, which I think is quite interesting. So the other thing then to think about is what the countervailing pressures might be culturally. And I can't do justice to the idea of the infodemic, where essentially we're overwhelmed by information and tweets and just stuff about on social media. But I think it was quite interesting to me how, for example, many in the West didn't fear disclosure as much as might have been imagined. At one point, absolutely everybody was declaring they had COVID-19. I think if I remember, there was Michel Barnier, Boris Johnson, Prince Charles had it. Prince William didn't declare that he had it. He said he thought it would be distracting for everybody, which is quite interesting. But, celebs were posting a lot, Idris Elba, there's just, and so forth. So I think it's quite interesting that that happened. And in fact, there was almost a little bit of a backlash. Why are all these celebrities getting tests? Where are they getting them from? Why am I not at the front of the queue, and so forth? So I thought that was quite an interesting, and obviously speaks to power, because these individuals often extremely, in powerful positions. So I suppose the point I want to make is, of course, the link between celebrity and virus isn't new. With HIV, for example, Magic Johnson came out as having HIV. We had Charlie Sheen more recently, and so forth. But that was a long time into those epidemics, and it hasn't been followed by a whole heap of other people. So I think that's quite an interesting phenomenon that we might think about. And one of the reasons that I've kind of tentatively suggested, I'm not 100% convinced this this is the case. But I think the fact of who was the first person to the first celebrity to transparently disclose that they had COVID-19 may play a role here. So Tom Hanks was the first, I think back in March 2020, him and his wife, Rita Wilson, I think she was going on a singing tour of Australia, and essentially they posted either on Instagram or Facebook, I can't remember now, a kind of piece that said, we have COVID, we're following the advice of doctors, it was all very responsible, and it was a very transparent disclosure. Now you might argue, of course, that people had to be transparent because perhaps newspapers would have published that anyway, but I think it's interesting. I've called it the Hanks effect, you know, white, middle class, brilliant actor with a great reputation. In a way, if you had to pick somebody who could be that archetypal person to be transparent about COVID-19, you might have picked Tom Hanks. And I think perhaps that little bit set the tone. And there's quite an interesting paper that came out that showed that people sort of, it almost put a little bit of a friendly face onto this extremely terrifying virus at the time. Now, that doesn't mean that celebrities get off scot-free. Where celebrities display greed or ostentatiousness, or they bend their rules, like Rita Ora had, I don't know, at least 3 parties in a row or something, didn't seem possible to not have a party in lockdown, they tend to be shamed and blamed. Okay, so there is some tone deaf, you know, I'm thinking of Ellen and her gay prisoners, she referred to it, and also I think Kim Kardashian went on a fabulous island holiday where no one wore masks, having everybody being tested literally at sort of that when death rates were incredibly high in the US. So it doesn't necessarily mean that celebrities' behavior is always counter-stigmatizing, it just means that it possibly could be, and I suppose that's what I'm suggesting. So I want to finish up now just with some concluding remarks. So what I've argued in this talk is that it's helpful for us to consider stigma as processual, because I think it helps us, or it sort of gives us, I guess, a vocabulary through which we can think about the rapid emergence of, but also the ongoing change, because of course it's ongoing now, in pandemic stigma. Okay, and the second thing I think I've hopefully offered for you is some core dimensions or concepts through which we could think about this change. So the idea of stigma lineage and the historicity of stigma variation, how it appears differently over time through content and context, and also this idea of amplification and the sort of diminishment as well. So that's how I've tried to articulate this change. And the final thing really to think about, and then we'll think how things are mutating in the future, and I'm kind of hoping you're going to do that work for me really, is also, I think that this metaphor is useful because it provides quite a clear role for public health and social scientists. So not only are we there to hopefully disrupt stigma as it occurs and prevent it proliferating, could we even possibly prevent its emergence if we understand its emergence better? And I think that's an interesting question. So this is my final slide, and I really do want to go over to you. I could suggest loads of ways in which I think COVID-19 stigma is mutating in relation to, you know, what is currently stigmatized, vaccination, age, mask, the whole thing. But I think at this point, I mean, really what I've hoped to do is just give you a vocabulary to talk about it, and I'd be fascinated to hear what everybody thinks. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides now, hopefully. Press to exit. Okay. How can I stop my slide sharing?
Go to the top of
share. Okay,
yeah,
I'll get there in the end. You can tell I'm very not experienced at this point, so sorry about that.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you so much for that really rich and interesting talk. And I think Fred and Arthur would agree with me that it's so relevant for the writing that we're doing at the moment, thinking about how shame and stigma are circulating in the UK during 2020. So I really appreciate your insights, and I think the concepts and formulations you're offering around stigma are really, really useful. And yeah, thank you. And I'm opening the floor now to questions and comments. So if anyone would like to ask Hannah any questions about the work or offer comments or suggestions, please do.
That would be fabulous. I was also going to say, and I discussed this with Luna earlier, I mean, if you want to put your camera on now, I'd be absolutely delighted to see any faces that want to appear. No obligation at all, but I've been speaking to a screen for 40 minutes and I feel like I'm alone in my room. So if anybody wants to put their cameras on, say hi and ask questions as a human to a human, that would be absolutely fabulous as well, because like I say, it's a slightly disconcerting experience just speaking to your own slides. So that would be fabulous. And all questions, comments and ideas welcome.
Yes, Jill, go ahead.
Hello, good afternoon. What an amazing talk. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much for that. I wondered whether you had come across any historical stigma that might have been attached with another pandemic in the Spanish flu in the last century, and whether there are any commonalities of stigma that may have appeared in in both pandemics.
Well, that's a very interesting question, because I read a really great book. I've got a feeling it's actually holding my laptop up at this very moment, which is by Alex de Waal, which is called New Pandemics, Old Politics, which actually looks at the last 200 years of pandemics. And he has a very interesting take on the flu there, which really is quite different than the manifestation of stigma and than the other epidemics that he looks at. So he looks at lots of different epidemics in each of the chapters, and also COVID-19. So it's very much written for COVID times. But he makes a really interesting point, is to a large extent, and perhaps we have been talking about Spanish flu recently because of COVID-19, but unlike some kind of epidemics which kind of haunted everybody, there was a lot of forgetting around Spanish flu. In other words, it didn't sort of stay in the institutional memory quite as much as it might have done, given it literally was the largest in terms of the death rates and so forth that came about. And it was interesting. I mean, his theories around this relate to the fact that people sometimes, and I'd be very interested to see if this happens with COVID-19, is his arguments were that people almost want to forget sometimes. In other words, they don't want to remember, and that actually things that are very frightening and scary, and of course at that time extremely uncontrollable and just had to be led to burn, didn't have vaccinations, and so it had to be burnt out, if you like. Perhaps it was so terrifying it almost didn't go into as much memory and as much history and much institutional memory as it could have done. So that was a really interesting take to me. I think we have reactivated memories about it, partly because of this labeling of Spanish flu, which of course now we perceive that to be pejorative labeling around so if you don't want to call things Spanish flu or whatever, and the WHO intervention speaks around that. So, I mean, do you have some ideas on how that might work out?
No, I was just wondering about the stigma attached to Spain, but no, I've been doing some reading because I'm hoping to sort of get the influence of COVID into my current PhD proposal and how that's affecting market life in the UK. But, I mean, perhaps following your line, are we likely to forget about the pandemic in the future, because it's been such an impact on society, on the economy and the political stage? And, very cynically, I'm thinking now that life is very cheap as long as the economy is working, and that's really harsh, and that's a very unpleasant aspect of perhaps politics and the anti-vaxxers, etc. And I'm very anxious about the complacency of the general public these days, and perhaps the stigma will be prolonged with these sorts of approaches to how we manage it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, already we're seeing these discourses around getting back to normal no, we still really need to pay it a lot of attention. So I think we are already seeing that, you know, some people really do want to forget about it. And so, for example, wearing a mask, which then of course is a very visual representation that marks the person out as potentially contaminating, because, you know, why would you be wearing a mask if and so forth if that wasn't the case, then becomes symbolic of some of these bigger discourses, you know, around getting back to normal or continuing to remind people. So I think that's a lot of people's discomfort around masks is simply that it's just reminding people all the time about it, and it certainly isn't a neutral marker, if you like, in any way. There's some fantastic points in the chat that we could come back to too.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Other questions or comments from the room? Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi there, afternoon. Thank you so much, Hannah. Yeah, really interesting talk. So I've joined from sort of a policing perspective. We did meet years ago.
Yeah, I thought you looked, I thought your name was familiar
yeah.
to me, but yeah, that's right. It's in a completely different context, isn't it? Working with the police.
Yes,
okay,
working with Neil Ralph, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, fantastic.
But, yeah, lovely chat. Just from a policing perspective, just what you were talking about there was resonating, because obviously the impacts of those stigmas then can play out, if you like, in terms of you know, managing antisocial behaviour and enforcing some of the restrictions and so on, albeit there was a 4-step process before that in terms of engaging and so on. But I think it, you know, it did play out within policing as well, in terms of some of the messaging that came out around people's behaviour is wrong, and you know, some videos that were circulated and photographs that were posted. I think you mentioned the photographs, but it's just really interesting around sort of learning from that experience, and that's part of the work that I'm doing now around just learning the lessons of COVID. And I think that, you know, there is definite area to learn, but also just understanding it does link to the stigmas that were put on, and the importance of the comms around it. But it's just sort of an observation, and just your thoughts around, you know, the impacts on policing and like you say, public policy in a broader sense moving forward.
No, I think that's a very that's a fascinating thing to try and think through, because as you say, particularly, and also it gets very amplified by social media. So there'd be two things I want to say. One of which is, of course, that social media then does amplify. Perhaps these aren't typical examples of policing. You know, there were a couple of examples where I think some women were strolling, having a coffee together. They were deemed to be too close. They weren't related, and they were fined. Although I think their fines were then, I can't remember what played out about it. But the point is, of course, is that might have been extremely atypical. It might have been that, in fact, that, you know, that wasn't happening in police forces around the country. But of course, you only need one example like that. You know, women having coffee together, the police. You know, that social media does become a way of amplifying that, and that's something that, when with comms, is very difficult to fight against, of course, because that's the dramatic, you know, example, isn't it? But we mustn't, of course, then fall into the trap of thinking that it is typical, because it isn't necessarily. So that would be the first thing I would say. And the second thing has been really interesting, talking to my students about this. So I've been talking about COVID-19 stigma. And I can see some comments about long COVID, which I think would be really interesting to come back to in a minute. And we've been examining papers around long COVID and COVID stigma and so forth in my medical sociology class. And when I say to the students, who's been stigmatized in COVID times, they say students, right? Young people, students, right? And I say, tell me more about this. And I mean, there were several examples of this, you know, so there was a lot of posting of young people's activity, you know, hovering around in parks, you know, then being posted on websites like Nextdoor, you know, these teenagers are hanging out together. As it turns out, what we actually discovered about COVID-19, they were probably hanging out in the safest place. I mean, it probably was technically against the rules, but being in a park, as it turns out, isn't the worst thing they could have done. But we didn't know that in the middle of, say, 2020. So there was a lot of young people feeling a bit under surveillance from that. And then, of course, the other example was when the students in the UK were asked to go back to university. So they went back to university duly, and they spread COVID everywhere they went. So we immediately had an outbreak at Exeter. And again, this then speaks to stereotypes and representations about students. So they were deemed to be partying all the time. And the students were telling me in class, we weren't partying, you know, we weren't, most of the time we weren't doing anything. It's actually the household transmission. The fact that we're 4 people from different families, all little 10 people in a flat, you know, these flats, sort of big apartments that are then just in together. And in fact, that, you know, we were often following the rules around households, but we were just risky households. So I think they felt quite unfairly stigmatized and demonized at times for doing things that they were told to do by government. And then this concept, as I said, of young people as almost delinquent and negligent and so forth, that then came out. So they feel quite indignant that they were blamed for something. And of course, again, as it's turned out, you know, they're not necessarily the ones most at risk. So there's a whole load of factors there. But I think the portrayal of young people has been quite interesting. And there's a whole other paper in that for me. So
yeah, really interesting. And just quickly, sorry to hog it, when you were talking there, do you think it's almost inevitable then, because some of that was linked to sort of lack of awareness of us all? So we didn't realize that being outside was a good place to be earlier on, do you think? So in terms of if this happens again, or is it almost inevitable that these stigmas will form because we don't know any better to start with?
The one about sort of young people hanging around, I mean, you know, there's always a moral panics around young people doing things that young people do. You know, I teach a big course on illegal drugs and addiction, and, you know, this is a reoccurring theme. So perhaps there's nothing about that one. The one example of the students, of course, they were actually following government advice. They were told to return. And so they weren't doing anything against the rules in that case, which is why I think they still feel annoyed about the shaming that went on, because they perceive it to be very unfair. It wasn't justified because they did what they were told to do. And, you know, and students were really looked down for a lot more than some of the rest of us in Exeter. For example, there were still bans on student household mixing when the rest of our family household mixing was allowed in Exeter, for example. So I think it also has to do with perceptions of unfairness of those particular groups being, you know, being stigmatized, and how much of a threat did they really represent? It's difficult to quantify.
Yeah, really interesting. Thanks so much.
Okay, fantastic.
Thanks, Sarah. Other questions? I can kind of jump in from there, because I was speaking to Sarah last week as well, and one of the things we talked about was like the kind of considerable muddiness in the public health message coming from the government. So like you were saying, the students were told to go back to university, so that was what they're supposed to do, but then they're not supposed to do all of these other things. And I think oftentimes there was just a lot of there was just no clarity about, like, Ray, who gave the last seminar in this series, I recently listened to it because I missed it at the time, and he said that the lockdown rules changed 64 times between March and December. And at any one time, no one kind of was clear on what was actually legal and what was actually illegal, or what was merely recommended or not recommended, or what was acceptable and not acceptable. And that led to a really ripe kind of environment for stigma, shame, and blame to develop, because of the muddiness of the public health messaging, the lack of clarity, then people were left to police themselves. And this is something that, when Sarah and I spoke last week, that came up in our conversation about how the police were then inundated with, you know, people reporting on their neighbors, and these neighborhood disputes became like really amplified in COVID times, because you know, you had to police the boundaries of what was morally right, or also kind of right in a public health sense as an individual. because the messaging, what the hell did stay alert mean? Nobody knew what that meant. But also it was a very antagonistic message, because the only thing you could stay alert to was the virus, and the only place viruses were in people's bodies, so you're staying alert of others. So there was a very antagonistic atmosphere, I suppose, created. And it's one of the things that we're sort of arguing, I guess, is that atmosphere led to very fertile ground for stigma and shame. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and how the mutations of stigma are related to clarity or lack of clarity in the public health messaging.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting point. And I think that lack of clarity continues. We're all trying to, well, in fact, actually, the clarity is now you decide. You decide if you want to wear a mask. You seem to have to know. So, for example, some local places have decided that you would have to wear a mask. So some universities, for example, have decided that they're going to have masks on campus. Our own university has not followed suit yet. So there's a kind of extremely devolved, localized decision-making going on that then, as you say, causes maximum muddiness. Do I think that then causes more stigma? It's difficult to say. So let's take another example. I read in the paper, I don't know whether this is going ahead or not, that so we don't have vaccine passports in the UK currently, although that's not the case, because they have vaccine passes, I think, in Wales. So there are different parts of the UK, again, have different so there's differing policies around that. But in England at the moment, we don't have vaccine passports, whereas in quite a few countries, so France, Italy, and so forth, they do have these passports. And I did read in the paper that, for example, in Austria, they were thinking of essentially organising it so that the people who've had the double vaccine, and then the people who haven't had the vaccine, people who didn't have the vaccine should be sort of contained at home, if you like, and only allowed out for things such as buying food, exercise, and so forth. Now, it seems to me that's a very kind of top-down, we would find that very repressive and kind of state-heavy, police-heavy. So I don't, and I think then the stigma around not having had the vaccination might be really quite profound, whereas at the moment in the UK, who knows who's had the vaccine and doesn't? I can look at this list of names, I can't tell whether anybody's vaccinated or not, and so I think I'm not utterly I think there are ways in which muddiness is bad, but I also think that the policing in the UK and people policing themselves could be said to have some advantages in that it does leave the situation very fluid, whereas if you've got a very clear vaccinated, non-vaccinated people, you're going to get very overt, top-down, control of that. These people can go here, these people can't go here. So you're going to get spatial segregation and then potentially discrimination against people who either don't want to or not able to vaccinate. So I'm kind of half persuaded. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And just thinking about spatial segregation, it just reminded me of the kind of first local lockdown in the UK, which was in Leicester, and the lepers of Leicester immediately arose in that situation where a particular geographical location was marked out as more contaminated than others, but also that also fell along the lines of like ethnic minorities and socioeconomic status. So certain postcodes were marked as hot zones, and and it wasn't a coincidence that those postcodes were places where people were living in densely populated conditions and working in sweatshops and all of those things that all these kind of intersections of disadvantage, I suppose, that meant, like you say, I think that piece of your talk was really brilliant, thinking about which groups were at risk and were vulnerable also were the groups that are like traditionally socially disadvantaged and stigmatized, and how that the intersection of those two things just is really interesting to think about, the way that stigma and then blame can circulate, and how we can create these scapegoats almost instantaneously by thinking about those who are at risk, because they're also the most risky, and that's a really interesting formulation that I hadn't thought of, and I found that really useful, so thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
I'm just trying to take it all in. So first, thank you for the toolkit of concepts. I work with transgender and intersex communities, and so part of and I mentioned this book from Raza Kolb that talks about metaphor of from the cholera plague around Islam. So I'm playing with the idea of both how concepts of disease contagion translate into contagious identities, stigmatized identities, and the reverse, right? That stigmatized identities then get portrayed as disease. And so part of what I'm thinking about is gender in particular, right? This idea that's been invented recently of rapid onset gender identity disorder, right? That young people are contagiously becoming transgender because of cultural influences, as opposed to the culture giving space for people to be more authentic. I'm thinking about sexuality and gender, where men can be perceived as gay just because they hang out with women, or like the performativity and the surveillance that goes into gender. And so I know I'm a little bit off from the COVID kind of piece of tangible biophysical disease, but in terms of stigma, it feels like it's connected to me, and I wonder if you could help me think some more about some of those dynamics.
So the person that comes to mind as that will be fantastic to link back with this stuff is the work of Robert Crawford, because Crawford essentially explained, I mean, there's a couple of really seminal papers, and I'm happy to send them. I don't know if I've got a copy of the 1980 whatever one, but I definitely have got his version in 1992, and he looks at how, for example, in the HIV and AIDS epidemic, unhealthiness is projected onto whole groups. So the whole group, the gay community at the time, then becomes the at-risk group. So just simply being a member of that group then becomes, and that actually speaks very much to what Luna just pulled out, which is this idea of being at risk and then risky. So the idea was back in when people, with HIV and AIDS, in that epidemic, that originally public health was thinking, no, it's good that we know which communities might be affected, because then we can target them. We can do messages that will then be applied more to them. But of course, by pairing together this unhealthiness and projecting it onto the whole group, and this is what Crawford talks about, this projection of unhealthiness, so that everybody in the whole group becomes the risky people, you then get huge amounts of stigma and blame, and even violence and aggression. So, that then spilled into that. And of course, it also then led public health up a blind alley, because it was concerned with gay sex when it should have been also concerned with heterosexual sexual transmission of that disease. So I don't know if I can speak to it in relation to COVID-19, but I think that's what I would be thinking about, how these groups are, that risky groups. And to go back to Crawford's work, because it absolutely seems to be saying to me, this is what you're rediscovering again. And I think the idea of social contagion is very interesting that you mentioned. Has that helped at all?
Yeah, no, like I said, it's all just swirling, so it is helpful, and I'm writing down references and places to think about. I feel like there's some, I don't know what geometric shape is, right? But of interactive, more than two poles, more than a triangle, but like some kind of geometric shape of forces and so I think my point here is that your idea of lineage, right? It is that it has legs over centuries as these different things impact each other is really important. So thank you.
And not ending. So what you find now, this is why I suppose I was sort of thinking, because at that time I was in lockdown and bewildered about what COVID-19 meant. And I suppose that's why I was thinking of things as both emerging and continuing. So you'll find that what you find right now is also mutating over time. And it's interesting to sort of track that. And as you say, you get new disease classifications or names of things, and you suddenly get something becomes very prominent, perhaps because a particular celebrity is identified in a particular way, and so all of these ideas of the emergence and amplification and so forth might be really interesting to work through with that particular example. I could think of loads of ways that could be really, really fun to think about.
It actually like made me thinking about, you mentioned social media, and I think that is something that is really key in COVID as a kind of catalyst to these mutations, and how rapidly the messages around COVID can shift and be kind of upturned as well. And I wonder, I mean, is that something that you think is really important in thinking about the mutations during COVID as compared to previous epidemics and pandemics?
Yeah, absolutely. Because of course, with social media also, I mean, you get some global stories which everybody knows about. So I don't know how many followers Nicki Minaj has, but she tweeted, I'm not even going to repeat what Nicki Minaj said because it's so ridiculous. But anyway, it was a kind of anti-vaxxer statement about the health effects, let's say, I should put it politely if anyone knows the tweet I'm referring to, the health effects that could potentially happen to men if they had the vaccine. So that would be like a global, so you get global tweeting, but you also then get local tweets, for example, that national stories that come up. And there's been some really interesting work about how that occurs. I can't think of the paper name, but it was scholars writing about, particularly in Southern Africa, in South Africa, and a couple of other countries around that region, about how particular stories became very, very amplified. And then these celebrities typified a certain response early on. And that was actually before the vaccine. So that's a very interesting idea. So yes, I think it has the effect of we get overwhelmed with information. Things can circulate. Tom Hanks and his that, I put Hanks, H-A-N-X, because that's how he signs his name, by the way. I do know how to spell Hanks. That's how he signs off his cool communications. So that would just go global immediately. But I think we also have to be alert that social media also has its localized versions, and that things that become important in one locale don't necessarily always translate elsewhere. So, you'll get things about Chinese celebrities in China and so forth, that particular ones that, for example, declared that their family had the virus and so forth. So I think we don't always want to assume that social media is global, but do we think it can massively amplify existing prejudice? Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Fred, go ahead.
Hi, Fred.
Oh, brilliant talk. And thank you for reminding me about Nicki Minaj, because I've had a long day and I need to remind myself that I live in a world where that tweet happened. So thank you. Very kind of unformed kind of question. Because of the quote you use from Strong, and the way you talk about mutation, I'm kind of staying with an earlier question. To some extent, do you think of yourself as using the disease metaphor to talk about stigma? And if you do, I'm thinking about what potential limitations there are for that, just in terms of I tend to associate thinking about things as epidemics or plagues as something which actively works against a historical mode of questioning. And actually, this is a fantastically historically embedded paper, really, really interesting work. But then also kind of, to me, the idea of mutation sometimes implies kind of unpredictability, whereas actually I think stigma has landed in incredibly predictable ways a lot of the time throughout this pandemic. I don't know, that's not exactly a question. I don't know what that
No, I dithered over the metaphor myself because I just thought perhaps I've been trapped in too long with the idea of viruses and mutation, and I can't think outside this metaphor. So I'm not 100% convinced that it would be applicable in every way, because obviously the idea of mutation is usually a negative one as well. I mean, not always, but we do tend to talk about mutants and Frankenstein type of mutation. So there are those connotations to the word, but I suppose, as I said, because I hang out quite a lot with the philosophy of biology people and biologists and geneticists, I suppose I'm thinking of it in that slightly more neutral way of things just simply having lineage but changing over time and new variants, and literally taking that biological language and trying to get away from sort of scary Frankenstein monsters, I suppose. Whilst I would say that there has been some predictability, I think there's other things that haven't been very predictable, actually. I don't think, for example, that COVID-19, and I might be saying something controversial in a series about COVID-19, but I actually don't think it was as intensively stigmatized as it could have been, for example, in the UK. I think there have been some really egregious examples of that stigmatization, healthcare workers who, people saying things to them in the supermarket, but in general, that hasn't been the experience of people. And I think that it's interesting, and like I say, if you read the accounts of what some people have experienced in South America, healthcare workers have experienced in Chile, or what healthcare workers have experienced in the Iraqi example I gave, that's very, very intense stigmatization to the life-threatening level. And so I think actually it has been a little bit more unpredictable. I expected far less disclosure. I didn't expect celebrities to be quite as transparent as they were about it, and that kind of surprised me, because it happened like really within a month or two of hearing about it, and it seemed to me it was quite a dangerous social identity to hold at that time for Tom Hanks, that he took a risk by doing that. And that surprised me. And then after that, I don't know, you could feel, I don't know, why do we think celebrities then piled in on top of that? Do they just love publicity at any cost? Were they going to get outed anyway? What kind of things were going on there? I don't fully have a reading of that, but I think it was a little bit unpredictable, because people have gone to great lengths to hide all other kinds of things and take out super injunctions about other aspects of their status and their behavior. So that sort of surprised me a little bit. What do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. I suppose my immediate response is that it's as you actually alluded to quite a bit, that someone like Tom Hanks can afford to disclose in ways that actually aren't accessible for vast amounts of other people. But yeah, no, I take a lot of your points. I think that's really.
But I think what's interesting about that, though, is it does model that as a social norm. So actually, if a high status person discloses their status, then yes, you're right, they can only do that because they hold that high status. But what we know from stigma theory is stigma doesn't stick to those people. And actually, if stigma, Boris had COVID-19 when he was supposed to be protecting the entire nation from it, but it didn't stick as much as it could have done to them, and that's due to their high status. But what it then does do is opens up a new social norm of disclosure, which has actually then gone on to be actually moderately sort of counter stigmatizing.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
I think Arthur had a question.
Yeah, thank you. I just warning, if I've got a dog here and I'm in South Africa at the moment and there's a troop of baboons walking around the house. So if the dog goes wild, then just I'll mute myself so that it doesn't quite get as exciting as it may sound. I thought this was a fantastic paper, and a great presentation and a great paper. And I suppose it's not really to challenge the model in any way, but but to ask you what your thoughts are in maybe refining it, because this seminar series is on shame and stigma, and you talked about stigma, and I know that there's, always going to be in sort of like sociological public policy work, a kind of a hesitancy about talking about shame in relation to stigma, but nevertheless, the two things are connected. I was sort of wondering what, and to use the terms that you use in the paper version of your talk, what kind of relationship you would think about emerging from felt stigma? So in the paper you say it's also stigma is also experienced internally as felt stigma, either as self-stigma, feeling shame towards oneself, or perceived stigma, anticipating others' stigmatizing views or behaviors. And I was thinking about a kind of shared topic that we're both interested in, which is to do with kind of smoking and particular stigmas that arise in relation to smoking and COPD, and the complication that occurs when those two things are mixed, right? I'm thinking about the way, particularly the way that people who are smokers will report feeling stigma or feeling shame when they're on a bus and they start coughing. Now, what's interesting in those situations is that the person telling you the story is telling you that they feel like they're being stigmatized because they're a smoker, and they're coughing because they're a smoker and things like that. But what's probably more likely in the kind of general imaginary of what it is that makes people stigmatize coughing on buses, even pre-COVID, is that people aren't thinking of you as a smoker, they're thinking of you as a potential disease vector, right? Now, why I bring this up is because there's obviously then going to be a mismatch between the felt stigma that you might have in terms of how you feel about it, but also how you project or anticipate a kind of stigma, and the forms of kind of stigma that are actually, I guess, for want of a better word, floating around. And I was wondering then, how would you think about the ways in which the mutation may be affecting both lines of misinterpreted or misaligned stigmas? So the felt stigma that somebody might have versus the kind of general stigma, because a lot of your talk is about the general stigma. And I was wondering if one starts to think about the ways in which people who sometimes experience stigma try to throw off that stigma by differentiating themselves from other, even more marginalized groups, and how those kinds of behaviors may themselves have their own kind of mutation trajectories, and that somebody who's a smoker or has COPD is going to kind of course, be an at-risk group in terms of COVID-19, but is also going to be saying, well, I don't have COVID-19. I have this underlying health, this ongoing chronic health condition, and I need, you need to distinguish me from those people, whatever. And that sort of maybe also ties into some of the things that Chris Johnson's been writing in the chat about the ways in which, say, long COVID is developing stigma in many of the same ways that are associated with ME and CFS, FM, but that also long COVID has been an opportunity for people with long COVID have also shown this kind of tendency at times to say, well, I've got long COVID, I don't have ME or these other conditions, and that I mean, those alliances, there's been a rapprochement between those two, but just thinking about the early phases of long COVID, I don't know if any of that is, makes sense, or you can make sense.
It completely does. So let me have a think of this through. So firstly, I think that, I mean, Scambler makes a very interesting distinction between shame and blame, and it's perfectly possible for you to be externally shamed but not feel shame yourself. For example, I don't think Rita Ora felt remotely shamed for having a birthday party, otherwise she wouldn't have had one in the first place. And so she was able to, you know, didn't internalize that in any way, and because she had one about a week later. So, you know, obviously people always don't, you know, even when externally people try to shame and blame and put them on the front of the newspaper, people don't always internalize that. And I think that's a really good point. The second thing that I think, and I actually did write a paper called something like, I can't remember, it was called The Stigmatization of Smokers. So this actually speaks to your smoking example. Was I interviewed lots of people who were smokers, and what I found was that people who were sort of working class, socio-economically disadvantaged smokers were much more, well, not much more likely in a statistical sense, but the kind of discourse they came up with was very much about blaming themselves. So they were really internalizing that stigma. I'm a dirty, disgusting smoker. It's my fault that I got this illness. I've been smoking, and so forth. So it's very internalized. Whereas the more middle-class smokers that I had interviewed did exactly what you just said about projecting it onto, well, I'm only a social smoker anyway, I'm not even that unhealthy. There was a lot of identity work in which they didn't internalize the stigma. So I think that you've got to remember that groups that are already stigmatized may be more likely to internalize stigma. In other words, if you already feel a little bit diminished by society and a little bit devalued on some other level, then you're going to incorporate that new stigma even more easily and internalize it. Whereas, like I say, you know, some politicians like Trump and Boris Johnson seem almost Teflon coated in their ability to get COVID-19 and mysteriously not really kind of, you know, feel too internally bad about it at all. So I think that is a function of social position, the extent to which people internalize that. I mean, there's limits to that argument, and if the stigma was very heavy. So, I mean, that's kind of what I'm thinking about, is just that it does relate to social position. And you're right, not everybody is going to feel shamed or blamed by external stigma coming towards them, but some people will, and those people are more likely to already be marginalized and stigmatized in the first place. And I don't think that's a finding that's unique just to smoking, by the way. I'm pretty sure that, you know, it might hold elsewhere. So does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I suppose I was also wondering then how you might think of the ways in which those internal functionings might have their own mutation trajectories. You know,
okay, can you give me an example? What do you mean it could kind of, do you mean like the psychological distress of being stigmatized? Because there's been quite a few papers about, for example, Asian Chinese communities' distress of being very, you know, suddenly finding themselves in the middle of this sort of hugely amplified kind of.
I guess it's more about like I suppose I was thinking about long COVID and the ways in which sort of the perception of stigma around long COVID in its earliest phases was about there's a kind of much more of a rapprochement now to existing kind of long-term medically unexplained illnesses like ME, etc., etc., etc. But at first, there was a real attempt to almost set it in distinction to those other conditions, and there was a kind of pushback, at least in terms of the academic side of these kind of debates, on the fact that, well, ME, people who've been writing about ME and trying to get recognition for ME have been doing this for decades, and long COVID could come skate along the top of that work and then just claim itself as different. And so, but what it seems like there is a way of arguing that conflict as being about internal various forms of felt stigma that are themselves mutating according to the different kind of according to their own vectors, not necessarily in terms of the broader question of stigma of mutation. So I was just sort of thinking that maybe the model might also work for felt stigma in ways that line up, but not exactly with what's happening in the kind of broader stigma mutation kind of conversation.
Yeah, I think you make a really interesting point, and I noticed Chris Johnston's point in the chat about that, and I think it is very interesting because early on I was hearing a lot of arguments about how I suppose the naming and invention of long COVID might destigmatize other chronic health conditions such as liminal conditions that have been highly contested like ME and so forth. And it's interesting now that actually that didn't seem to hold for very long, and actually that, you know, we're seeing the resurgence of, oh well, you know, it's mainly women that have it. Oh, well, you know, these people are just chronically ill over a very long period of time or whatever. And so it's interesting that that potential for long COVID to destigmatize these other illnesses perhaps hasn't been realized in the way that originally we thought it would. And in fact, if anything, it's going down quite traditional grooves, perhaps. And that's a little bit depressing to say that. So thank you, Chris, for those comments.
We've got 5 more minutes. So Emma has her hand up.
Hello, sorry, I've had to dial in on my phone. Picking up on both Frederick's point and Arthur's actually. So in terms of ME, first of all, I was diagnosed in 2005 with ME, and it certainly does raise the point that actually we're now in a time where when I was diagnosed, it wasn't fully understood ME, and it was certainly labelled often as depression. With COVID coming along, it's putting forward a lot more of what people have been trying to get raised, the awareness of ME and what that involves and how that changes people's lives. And it's becoming more acceptable, which does seem to be changing that stigma surrounding things. And I think a lot of it, this is just my personal opinion, is that we're starting to understand more because it's affected a much wider number of people and not individuals. We're talking about on a larger scale. It also raises, and this links in with Frederick's point, in terms of the transparency on things, that with where society has become more transparent, we've had, from a police perspective, a lot more is disclosed and more transparent, not just police, but the public sector. That's going along within government and the entertainment industry. Is a lot of that transparency that's happening in society changing stigma and the shame that comes with it? Or do you actually feel that because of the stigmatization of a lot of things, people are actually becoming more transparent? And it sort of links in with, it might be 2 separate points, but it links in also with where we are changing going forward in society with the learning of this health side, these new things that are coming in and affecting a lot of what we are sort of haven't known so much about the health industry and other health related ailments. It's changing a lot of that transparency within society. So
yeah, thank you, Emma. Yeah, I've got lots of thoughts, but I'm not sure if they're very coherent because it seems to me that there's sort of lots of different things going on. I think your point about the biological discourse then becoming quite powerful, and particularly, and I think that still is going on. The idea that long COVID is related to, you know, the after effects of the virus in the body, and that might be measurable and quantifiable by science and in a ways that, you know, so it's not just all in the head, because of course this is, as you say, the clash of discursive of clash around, well, very real clash actually, because then treatments were based on that, very real clash for people with ME, that then has become, you know, it sort of weighted things towards the biological explanations, if you like. And of course, there were some quite powerful figures both within academia and also sort of parliamentarians, and papers were written in the BMJ and so forth by people who were experiencing long COVID. And because of course they then had that higher status, they were able to attract attention. There's a brilliant, I think it's Pellegro paper, which was in Social Science and Medicine, about the naming of long COVID and how that occurred, and how those higher status groups were able to hear definitions, and it was more publicly defined almost than any other medical condition, which I thought was really interesting. Your point about disclosure is again another, you know, I'm sort of just mulling it over. I'm not quite sure what to think, but one of my students came up with a really interesting point. So I was presenting some material about this to them and asking them about COVID, how they thought COVID-19 was mutating. And one of them said it's almost like not having COVID-19 now isn't really stigmatized that much. And people are going around saying, oh, my aunt got it, my kids and my children had it, for example, over the summer, and I'm embarrassed to tell you that, you know, this is just standard stuff these days. But she said, what is stigmatized is not being transparent about it. So if you went to someone's house and you didn't disclose, for example, you were waiting for a PCR test result, then you might be thought to put the person at risk. So she was arguing, which I think is a really interesting point, that it's not the having of the virus or the having of the thing, but the lack of transparency actually that can be stigmatized in its own right. Because if you don't disclose your status, you're essentially then putting people at risk in some way, which I thought was a really, really interesting move, rather than the virus itself being the thing that's actually stigmatized, is, you know, not telling people you might have it or hiding it. Or so transparency actually in itself then becomes something, again, in that mix, in quite a complex way. Then becomes a social norm of transparency, and those who don't meet the norm of transparency are then sanctioned for that. Which is really, really, really interesting.
Yeah, thanks. That totally resonates with recent experiences I've had, Hannah, about the norm about transparency, but I hadn't thought about it particularly in that way. We have to wrap up, and thanks, Emma, for your comments as well. And thank you again, Hannah. I mean, I feel like we could just keep on talking.
I know, I feel like I really, really enjoyed it. It's so great to hear people's ideas and to just, you know, and I feel like there's so many more examples, masks, vaccines, there's just so much to think through, but we have to stop, Luna.
Yeah, no, and it's so rich, and we'll definitely speak to you again. Thank you, Fred, for posting there the link to our next seminar. Yeah, just please join me again in thanking Hannah for this really rich and fascinating talk and discussion, and I hope to see you all again at our next seminar, and hope to see you soon, Hannah. See you next week, I hope.
Absolutely.
Take care, everybody, and thank you for coming.
Okay, yeah, thank you.